The night my father died, my cousin Aldous smiled at me across the great hall, and I understood that the war for Ravensmoor had already begun. They had not yet carried my father's body from the north chamber. The physicians were still folding their useless instruments into their bags. The chaplain still had his hand on the cold brow, murmuring the words that do the dead no good and the living no harm. And through the tall doors of the great hall, where the household had gathered in the ugly, restless hush that follows a death in a great house, my cousin Aldous Crail caught my eye across all that black-clad grief, and he smiled. Not a cruel smile. That was the terror of it. It was a warm smile, a patient smile, the smile of a man who has waited a long while for a door to open and has just heard from the far side the click of the latch. I was 39 years old that night, and I had commanded men at the border forts, and I had faced the reivers who came down out of the high country in the bad winters, and I had never in my life been afraid the way that smile made me afraid. Because a reiver you can meet with steel. A cousin who smiles at your father's deathbed you cannot meet with anything at all, except the slow, grinding machinery of law and blood and time. And every wheel of that machinery, I would learn before the week was out, my cousin had already greased. I was the Warden Duke of Ravensmoor now. The title had come to me across my father's body like a stone laid on my chest. Keeper of the northern march, holder of the border seat, master of the hard grey country where the kingdom frayed out into moor and fell, and the long disputed line. It is not a soft inheritance. The wardenship is a duty before it is a dignity, to hold the north, to keep the peace of a country that does not much want to be kept, to answer to the crown for every raid and every quarrel along 200 miles of bad frontier. My father had held it 40 years and it had worn him to gristle. Now it was mine, and I did not have 40 years. I did not, that autumn, feel I had 40 weeks. Because I was hurt. That is the thing that shaped all the rest, and I will not hide it from you, for I promised someone once that I would never again hide the truth of my own body from anyone who had a right to know it, and you who listen have as much right as any. I had taken a wound at the ford in the last week of my father's dying. A dispute along the line had gone from words to blades faster than such things should, and a border man's steel had gone into me low on the left side, below the ribs, and though I had ridden home and kept my feet and let no man see me fall, the wound had not closed. It wept. In the cold it woke like a second heart beating wrong under my hand. The physicians pursed their lips and spoke of humors and rest and did nothing, and I did not trust them to do more than nothing, because by then I had begun to understand that I could not trust anyone under my own roof at all. That was the internal war, and it had begun long before my father was cold. I want you to understand how a great house is taken from within, because it is not taken the way a fort is taken, with fire and a breach in the wall. It is taken quietly, a soul at a time, with coin and promises and the patient purchase of small loyalties, until one morning the master of the house looks up and finds that every hand that serves him serves another man first. Aldous Crail was my father's brother's son, and by the entail of Ravensmoor, an old, hard, unbreakable settlement laid down when the wardenship was granted, meant to keep the border seat always in a fighting man's hand and never let it be split or sold. If I died without a lawful heir of my own body, everything came to Aldous. The title, the lands, the wardenship, the whole crushing weight of the North. There was no other heir between us. There was only me, wounded and weeping blood into my dressings in the cold, and Aldous, whole and patient and smiling, one death away from everything. And he had not been idle. While I held the line at the border and buried my father, my cousin had been buying my house. I saw it first in small things, the way you see the first gray light before you are sure the night is truly ending. A door that hung open where Aldous stood in the corridor, as though someone wished him to hear what passed in the room beyond. A dish set before me at table that arrived cold, so that I ate less, so that I weakened, a small thing, a nothing, except that it happened too often to be a nothing. The steward's ledgers, when I called for them, had learned a strange new grammar. The figures did not lie outright, but they no longer told me the truth. And when I pressed the steward, he had a smooth answer ready, always ready, ready before I had finished asking, the way a man is ready who has rehearsed his answers with someone else. My valet, who had dressed me since I was a boy, would not quite meet my eye when he changed the linen on my wound, and I lay awake at night in the great cold bedchamber of the Warden Duke's, listening to my own house breathe around me, and I understood that I did not know, of all the souls within these walls, which 2 or 3 had not already taken my cousin's coin. That is a particular loneliness. I do not wish it on any man. To be the master of 200 servants and 100 rooms, and to sit in the dark and be unable to name 3 you would trust with a cup of water. Aldous did not need to have me killed. I want to be clear on that because it took me too long to see it, and the seeing of it was the beginning of my learning to think the way I had to think to survive. He did not need a knife in the dark or poison in the cup, though I came, in time, to think he was not above either. He needed only to wait. He needed only for the wound to do its slow work, or for the winter to do its work, or for the long grinding machinery of the entail to do its work, for me to die airless, as I seemed so very likely to do, and let the settlement hand him everything cleanly, lawfully, with his hands entirely empty of blood. And if I did not die quickly enough to suit him, he had the second course laid and ready, to have me declared unfit. An absent duke, a dying duke, a wounded and airless duke who could not govern the march. Let the magistrates at the winter assizes hear enough of that, from enough sworn mouths, and they might set the wardenship in a steadier hand until nature finished what the petition began. And the steadier hand, of course, would be Aldous Crale's. So I did the only thing a besieged man can do who cannot trust his own walls. I looked for the one thing my cousin could not buy or wait out or petition away. I looked for a lawful heir of my own body. I looked for a wife. And here is where the marriage market and I fell out, and where, though I did not know it, the true story begins. For the great houses of the North, hearing that the Warden Duke required a Duchess in haste, opened their doors with a joy I found frankly obscene. My father was scarcely in the ground, and already the mothers were writing, and the fathers were arranging to be at the same assemblies I was known to attend. And the daughters were paraded through my drafty rooms in a procession of lovely, accomplished, perfectly bred young women, every one of whom looked at me and saw a wardenship and a coronet and a dying man who might conveniently leave a young widow very rich. I do not say this to be cruel to them. They were doing what their world had trained them from the cradle to do, and some of them, I have no doubt, were as good as they were lovely. But I could not marry them. Do you see why I could not? A great house does not exist alone. Every one of those daughters came trailing a father, a family, a web of alliances and debts and ambitions. And in the North that autumn, there was one great ambition into which every web ran, sooner or later, and its name was Aldous Crale. I could not marry a bride and know that her father had not already made his private arrangement with my cousin. I could not lie down beside a duchess and not wonder whether she reported to Aldous over her morning chocolate. To marry into the marriage market was to marry, very possibly, a spy, to hand my cousin a listening post in my own bed and call it a wedding. I would as soon have handed him the keys to the muniment room and gone to sleep. So I sent them home. One after another, courteously, coldly, I sent them home. And the household watched and understood it after its own fashion, that the Warden Duke could not even secure himself a bride, that the Warden Duke was so far gone he turned away the loveliest girls in 3 counties, that the Warden Duke was finished. And the whispers of my unfitness grew a little louder in the corridors, and I knew that every one of those refusals was a small victory handed to my cousin. And I could not for my life see any other course. It was Isabel Marrow who changed the shape of the war, and she did it, in the beginning, entirely by accident, simply by being the one person at Ravensmoor who had never wanted a single thing from me in her life. I should tell you who she was, though the household would have struggled to tell you, for they had long since stopped seeing her. She kept the still room. That is the low, stone-flagged chamber that opens off the kitchen court on the north side, cool and dim, where the harvest of the physic garden is brought to be dried and hung and distilled, where the household's cordials are made, and its preserves, and the salves and simples and waters and tinctures that a great house in a hard country cannot do without, so far from any town with an apothecary worth the name. It is women's work, and it is invisible work, and it is, in a house like Ravensmoor, absolutely essential work, which is precisely the kind of work a great house forgets it depends upon until the day it is not done. She had come to us as a child. Her father had been a naval lieutenant, a good officer by every account, ruined by a court-martial over the loss of a ship that better men agreed was no fault of his, a scapegoat found and hung out for a failure that belonged higher up, as such failures so often are. He had died not long after of the disgrace as much as anything, and my father, who had known the man in some earlier and better chapter of both their lives, had done the great and careless kindness that great houses do. He had taken the orphaned daughter in. And then, in the way of great houses, he had entirely forgotten her. She had been perhaps 10. She had made herself useful, because a charity child who is not useful is a charity child whose charity may be withdrawn. She had learned the still room from the old woman who kept it then, and when that old woman died Isabel had simply, quietly kept it herself, and no one had thought to question it. And so by the autumn I am telling you of she was a woman of some 24 years who ran, alone and unregarded, one of the small vital engines of my house, and whom I could not, if you had asked me before that autumn, have told you the name of. I learned it at 3 o'clock in the morning, which became, in time, the hour of my whole life. I went to her because I could go nowhere else. The wound had bled through the dressing in the night badly, more than it had before, and I could not call my valet, because I did not know whose man my valet was, and a man does not bear his weakness and put a blade near his own opened flesh in the hands of someone who might serve his enemy. But it needed dressing, or I would wake weaker still, and weakness was the one thing I could not afford, for weakness was the whole of my cousin's strategy. And somewhere in the exhausted machinery of my mind I remembered the still room, salves, linen, the one place in the house where wounds were tended, and the one person, perhaps, in the whole of Ravensmoor who had no earthly reason to wish me ill, because she was so far beneath the notice of the war that no one had thought her worth the buying. I went down through the sleeping house, through the cold corridors, one hand pressed to my side, and I found the still room lit by a single candle, and Isabel Marrow awake at that dead hour, grinding something in a mortar with a slow, steady, unhurried patience, as though 3 in the morning were merely a quieter kind of noon. She looked up. She did not start or curtsy or fall into the flutter of a servant discovering the master where he should not be. She looked at me, and then she looked. I saw her eyes go to it directly at the dark stain spreading across the left side of my shirt, black in the candlelight, and her face did not change except to become, if anything, more awake. "Sit down, your grace," she said, "before you fall down, and I am left to explain to the whole county in the morning how the Warden Duke came to bleed to death on the still-room floor." I had not been spoken to plainly in a year. Do you understand what that does to a man? A year of smooth answers, ready answers, rehearsed answers. A year of every face arranged for my benefit and every word measured for its effect on a dying man's will. And here, at 3 in the morning, a still-room keeper told me to sit down before I fell down, as though I were simply a bleeding man, and she a woman who knew how to stop bleeding, which was, of course, exactly the truth of it, and the first plain truth anyone had offered me in longer than I could remember. I said. She did not ask my leave to touch me. She set aside her mortar, and she washed her hands, and she came and knelt beside the stool she had put me on, and she opened my shirt from the wound with a small clean knife, businesslike, her whole attention on the flesh and none of it on the coronet, and she looked at what my physicians had done, and I saw her mouth tighten. "Who dressed this?" she said. "My physicians. My valet changes the linen." "Then your physicians are fools and your valet is careless," she said, and then she stopped and knelt back on her heels and looked at me, really looked at me, up the length of my ruined shirt to my face, and something moved behind her clear eyes, some thought arriving that she did not like the shape of. "Or he is not careless," she said slowly. "Your Grace, a wound this deep, dressed this ill, will fester, and a wound that festers in a man who has no heir is a very convenient wound. I do not say it is more than carelessness. I say only that carelessness and murder can wear the same dressing, and I would not, if I were you, let the same hands change it twice." I looked at her for a long moment in the candlelight. I had known, in the abstract, cold way one knows a thing one has not let oneself feel, that I was being killed by slow degrees. But no one had said it. No one in my whole bought and whispering house had looked me in the eye and named the thing. And now a woman whose name I had learned 4 minutes ago had named it in the flat, unafraid voice of someone statting the weather. "You think someone wishes it to fester," I said. "I think," she said, taking up clean linen, beginning to work, her hands quite steady where mine that autumn had begun to shake, "that a man surrounded on every side by his cousin's servants would be a fool to let those servants tend the one wound that stands between his cousin and everything." She cleaned it as she spoke, and closed it and bound it, and her hands were sure and gentle and entirely without fear or flattery. "I have no cousin, your Grace," she went on. "I have no father to arrange me a marriage, no family to advance, no debt to any man in this house. I have nowhere else in the world to go, and no one on this earth to sell you to. That is the whole of my recommendation, and I am aware it is a strange one. But it is more than any physician in this house can say tonight, and you may make of it what you will." She tied off the linen. She sat back, and I sat there in the candle-light of the still-room with my side newly and honestly bound for the first time in a fortnight, and I understood that this unregarded woman had just offered me the single most valuable recommendation anyone at Ravensmoor could possibly have offered, that she wanted nothing, that she was owed to no one, that she stood entirely outside the war. In a house I could not trust, I had just found the one person no one had troubled to buy, for the simple reason that no one had ever troubled to see her at all. I did not sleep that night. I sat up in the great cold bedchamber with my honest bandage, and I turned the whole shape of my ruin over in my mind. And for the first time in months, I turned it not with despair but with the cold, waking clarity of a man who has found, at the very bottom of everything, one thing he can build on. I needed a duchess before the assizes. That much had not changed. But I did not need a duchess from the marriage market, with her train of alliances and her possible loyalty to my cousin. I needed the opposite. I needed a wife with no faction, no father, no web, no price, a wife whom Aldous could not have bought because he had never noticed her, could not unseat because she owed him nothing, could not turn because she had never been his to turn. I needed a duchess who stood, as this still-room keeper stood, entirely and unbuyably alone. I needed, I understood as the cold dawn came gray to the window, the woman who had just told me the truth about my own wound because she had nothing to gain by lying. I went back to the still-room the next night, at the same dead hour, and I offered Isabel Marrow a bargain as cold as I knew how to make it. Because in those days I did not know how to make an offer that was not cold, having spent a year learning to trust nothing and no one. And having not yet learned, as she would teach me, that there are things in this world that only warmth can win. She was there, as I had somehow known she would be, at her endless patient work in the single candle's light. She looked up at me and looked, at once, at my side, checking her own work. I understood. Seeing whether the dressing held and finding it whole, she looked back to my face and waited. "I have a proposal for you," I said, "and I will make it plainly, because you have dealt plainly with me and you deserve no less. You know the danger I stand in. You named it yourself last night better than my physicians have named it in a fortnight. I need an heir of my body, and a duchess my cousin cannot touch, and I need them before the winter assizes, or I will lose this house and the wardenship and very possibly my life to a man who is buying my servants out from under me one soul at a time." She had gone very still. She did not speak. She watched me with those clear, level eyes and let me say the whole of it. "I am asking you to marry me," I said. "I will not insult you by dressing it as more than it is. I do not offer you affection. I hardly know how to offer such a thing any more if I ever did. I offer you an alliance. Give this house a lawful line. Give me a duchess who stands outside my cousin's reach because she owes him nothing and never did. And in return you will have rank and safety, and a name that no ledger and no court and no cousin can ever erase, for the whole of your life, whatever becomes of me, and I will not pretend to you that what becomes of me may not be an early grave. Even so, even a widowed Duchess of Ravensmore is safe in a way that a still-room keeper never can be. That is what I am offering. I am aware that it is cold. I do not know how to offer it warm." She set down her pestle. She was quiet for a long moment, and I braced myself, I think, for tears, or for gratitude, or for the flutter of a woman overwhelmed by fortune, for all the responses my rank had taught me to expect and to despise. I got none of them. What I got was a still-room keeper who looked at me across her candle, and as coolly as I had named my terms, named her own. "If I do this," she said, "I have conditions, your grace, and you will agree to them now before the chapel, or not at all, because I have been managed my whole life, passed from my father's ruin to your father's charity to a forgotten corner of your house, always at the mercy of someone else's arrangement, and I will not walk into the largest arrangement of my life without terms of my own." "Name them," I said. "The still-room stays mine," she said. "I do not become a duchess who sits in a drawing-room and forgets she ever had hands. The still-room is the one thing in this house that is mine, that I built, that is honest, and I keep it, whatever I am called after the chapel." "Agreed. The underservants who have been kind to me," she said. "The girls in the kitchen court, the old women who taught me, the ones your cousin has never thought worth buying because they are worth nothing to a man who counts only stewards and valets. They keep their places, whatever becomes of me. If I die, if I am set aside, if this all comes to nothing, they are not turned out for having served the Duchess who failed. You will make me that promise, and you will keep it." Something in my chest, that had been a long time frozen, shifted at that. She was standing at the very door of rank and fortune, and the second thing she thought to secure was not for herself. It was for the kitchen girls. "Agreed," I said, and my voice was not quite as level as I meant it to be. "And last," she said, and here she rose and came around the bench and stood before me close so that I had to meet her eyes, "you will not lie to me. Not about the danger. Not about your health, not that wound, not what the physicians truly say, not how long they truly give you. Not about what this marriage is or is not. I will be a wife who knows the truth of her own life, your grace, or I will not be a wife at all. I have been managed. I will not be managed by a husband. If you want an ally who stands outside your cousin's reach, then treat me as an ally and not as one more servant to be handled with a smooth answer. That is my last condition, and it is the one I care for most." I looked at her a long moment, and I understood dimly that in agreeing to this last thing I was handing the only honest person in my house a lantern to shine into every dark and guarded corner of me, that I was promising the truth to a woman who, I already suspected, would have the disconcerting habit of recognizing it. I did not yet understand how much that promise would cost me, or how much it would give me back. "Agreed," I said. "On my honor as the last honest thing I have left, I will not lie to you, Isabel Marrow, not about the wound, not about the danger, not about what this is." And then, because she had been so plain with me, I made myself be plain in return, plainer than I had meant to be. "It is the easiest bargain I have ever struck, and I find, to my surprise, that it is also the first one in a year that I do not feel I shall come to regret." She studied me for a moment longer. Then she inclined her head, once, not a curtsy, an equal's nod, the seal on a treaty between two people who had each brought something the other needed to the table. "Then I will marry you, your grace," she said, "before the assizes, and God help us both." We married in the estate chapel 11 days later in the thin gray light of a border morning, and I arranged it so that my cousin would hear of it before the sun had set. That was deliberate. I could have wed her in secret and sprung it on the assizes like a trap, and part of me wished to. But I had begun, in those 11 days, to think the way I needed to think as Aldous thought, patiently, several moves out, and I judged that a secret marriage would only invite a secret answer, and that a secret answer from my cousin might come in a cup or on a stair rather than in a courtroom. Better, I thought, to marry her in the open, before witnesses, one of whom I knew to be my cousin's man, so that Aldous would learn of it at once plainly, and understand that the patient road to Ravensmoor now had a wall across it that no waiting could dissolve. Let him see the wall. Let him spend his cleverness on the wall and not on my dinner. So there were 3 witnesses in the cold chapel that morning. 2 I trusted: old Harrow, my father's chaplain, who had christened me and was too near his own grave to want anything from any man, and Breg, the master of horse, a blunt northern soul who had told my cousin's steward to his face, once, exactly what he thought of him, and had thereby recommended himself to me more than any oath could have. And the third was Netherby, the under-steward, a smooth and useful and thoroughly bought young man whom I invited precisely because I knew that whatever passed his eyes passed, by nightfall, into my cousin's ear. He would carry the news. That was his purpose. I married my Duchess in front of a spy on purpose, so that the spy would do his work well. She wore gray, a plain gown, well kept but far from new, that I understood without being told had been her mother's, the one fine thing, perhaps, salvaged from her father's ruin and kept through all the forgotten years. At the breast she had pinned a small sprig of rosemary, green against the gray, and when I looked at it she said, quietly, before the chaplain began, "For remembrance," and did not say remembrance of what, and I did not ask, though I have wondered since whether it was her father she carried into that chapel, or only the girl she had been before the world taught her to expect nothing. I put my grandmother's ring on her finger. It was too large. It had been made for a duchess who had borne 6 children and buried a husband and ruled the North 40 years, and it hung loose on Isabel's still rue-worn hand, and Harrow's old voice went on with the words, and I felt the wound wake in the cold of the chapel, low and wrong under my heart, and my hand, the hand that held hers to press the ring home, began, very slightly, to shake. She felt it. Of course she felt it. Her hand was in mine. And without a flicker, without a glance at me, without the smallest change in her grave attending face, she turned her own hand and closed her fingers over mine, steadying it, hiding the tremor inside the joining of our 2 hands, so that Netherby, watching, saw only a bride clasping her bridegroom's hand and could carry no report of a shaking, failing, dying Duke to the man who was counting on exactly that. It was nothing. It was a small thing, done in a moment, that only she and I ever knew, and it undid something in me that a year of siege had not so much as scratched. She had no reason to do it. The bargain did not ask it of her. I had bought her in every plain sense. I had offered her rank and safety in exchange for an heir and an alliance, and she owed me the letter of that and not one thing more. And in the first quarter hour of our marriage, unasked, at no gain to herself, she had covered my weakness with her own hand so that my enemy would not see it. No one had protected me in a year. I had forgotten it was a thing that could happen. And this woman, whom I had married for spite and strategy, did it before the ink of our vows was dry, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to shield the man beside her. I did not understand, that gray morning, what had begun. I understood only that something in the frozen middle of me had shifted, the way ice shifts on a river in the first thaw. A long, low, structural sound, felt more than heard. That means the whole hard surface of a thing has started, somewhere out of sight, to break. The household adjusted to a duchess it had not chosen, and it did so in 2 very different ways, and the difference between them became, in those first weeks, a map of the whole war. My cousin's people, the bought stewards, the smooth footmen, the valet I no longer let near my wound, watched her the way they watched me, carefully, sidelong, forever measuring. They had not been consulted. This marriage had happened over their heads and against their master's interest, and they did not know yet what to make of a duchess raised up out of the still-room, and until they knew, they watched and reported and waited. I could feel Aldous' attention through them like a draft through a door not quite shut. He was thinking. He was recalculating. Somewhere beyond my walls my cousin was sitting with this news and turning it over and looking for the crack in it, and I knew him well enough to know that he would find one, or make one, and that the finding or making of it would come soon, because the assizes were coming, and his patient road was blocked, and a blocked man grows less patient. But the other half of the household, the half no one counted, did something my cousin, for all his cleverness, never once thought to reckon with. It began to love her, out loud, and to arm her. I did not see it at first. Men in my position do not see it, that is rather the point. But she saw it because she had lived among them, and she told me of it in time. The kitchen girls, the scullery maids, the old women of the still-room court, the laundry women, the grooms' wives, the whole invisible underhouse that a great estate runs upon and never notices, these had known Isabel Marrow for 14 years. They had watched the charity child become the still-room keeper. They had been tended by her when they were ill, for she physicked the servants' hall as readily as the family and more kindly. And when she rose, impossibly, to Duchess, they did not resent it as an upstart's luck. They rejoiced in it as one of their own being lifted up, and they closed around her with a fierce, quiet, entirely unregarded loyalty that no coin of my cousin's had ever touched, because my cousin, like every man of his kind, counted only the servants who counted, and never once thought to buy a scullery maid. And the scullery maids, it turned out, heard everything. For this is the thing the men who scheme in great houses forget. They take such care to speak low before the steward and to seal their letters against the valet, and they never lower their voices before the girl carrying the coal, or the woman clearing the plates, or the maid making up the fire. Because to men like Aldous and his bought stewards, those women are not people who hear. They are part of the furniture of the room, like the sconces and the fire-irons. And so they said, before those women, things they would have died before saying to me. And those women, who loved my Duchess, carried every word of it to the still-room. She brought it to me at 3 in the morning, our hour. It became in those weeks the settled architecture of my nights that I would go down through the sleeping house to the still-room where she waited among the drying herbs and the ranked bottles, and she would lay before me, plainly and in order, everything the invisible underhouse had gathered. "This footman is your cousin's," she would say. "The laundry knows because he meets Netherby by the drying ground on Thursdays." This letter went out sealed and came back with the seal a little wrong. The girl who lays the fire in the muniment room saw it opened and closed again on the desk. "Your cousin has written twice this fortnight to a man in the assize town, a clerk of the court. The carrier's boy is sweet on one of our kitchen girls and cannot keep his master's business to himself." She laid it all out, this quiet stream of intelligence flowing up through the very floor of my house from the people no one saw, and I sat and listened, and for the first time in a year began to see my own war clearly. And I kept my side of the bargain. She had asked one thing above all others, that I not lie to her, not about the danger, not about the wound. And so at that same hour, among the same drying herbs, I told her the truth of my own body, that the wound wept still, that the physicians, whom I had at last let her replace with an honest man she vouched for, spoke of months and would not swear to years, that in the cold I felt it like a second failing heart. I told her the truth of the assizes, and how they stood, and how thin the margin was. I told her, plainly, things I had not been able to say aloud to another living soul in 12 months, because there had been no soul I dared say them to. And I will tell you what that did, because it is the truest thing in this whole account. For a year I had carried the entire weight of my ruin alone, the wound, the war, the whispers, the slow arithmetic of my own likely death, carried it behind a face I could never let slip, in a house where slipping meant losing. And now, at 3 in the morning, in a cold stone room that smelled of rosemary and beeswax, I set it down. I set it down before a woman who did not flinch from it, who took the worst of it. The months the physician would not extend to years, and simply nodded, and folded it into her clear grave understanding, and went on with what needed doing. It was like setting down a stone I had carried so long I had forgotten it was not part of my own body. And a man who has been allowed, at last, to set such a stone down, does not easily forget the hands that let him. I did not mean to begin loving her. I want that understood. It was not in the bargain, and I was not a man who had any faith left in such things, and I would have told you that autumn that I had married a useful ally and would keep her at the honest distance our treaty prescribed. But love does not consult the treaty. It came the way the thaw comes, not all at once, not by decision, but in the small hours over the honest laying down of true things, until one night I realized that I was no longer able to sleep at all except in that cold room, at that dead hour, in the company of the one person on earth I did not have to guard myself against, and that this was not strategy, and had not been strategy for some time. It came to a point on the night of the cordial, which I will now tell you plainly, for it was the night the war turned, and the night I understood what I had truly married. We kept a table still. A duke besieged from within cannot afford to look besieged. To withdraw from the world would only feed the whisper that I was unfit. So I dined in state as my father had, with such guests as the season and my rank required, and my new Duchess at the foot of the long table, and the household serving, the loyal and the bought together, because I could not yet purge the bought without knowing all their number. Among the guests that night was a man called Verrill, a smooth, agreeable, well-connected man who had, I knew, dined more than once at my cousin's table, and whose friendship with Aldous I had marked and said nothing of. I had invited him because to exclude him would have been to declare a suspicion I was not ready to declare. So he sat at my board and smiled and ate, and I watched him without seeming to, as I now watched everyone. The cordial came with the second course. It was Isabel's own, a clear, spiced, warming cordial she made in the still room and served at table in the cold months, a small famous pleasure of Ravensmore that guests spoke of and asked for. And Verrill drank of it and praised it, and within a quarter of an hour Verrill was gripping the edge of the table with a gray and sweating face, and then he was on the floor, convulsing, and the long table erupted into that particular chaos of a great dinner gone suddenly and horribly wrong. And I heard in the same instant, cutting through the chaos, exactly the words I had been half listening for without knowing it, the whisper that had plainly been prepared and set and waiting for its cue. It came from near Verrill, from one of the guests who was one of my cousins, and it was pitched to Carrie. The cordial. It was the cordial. The new Duchess's own cordial, and another voice, taking it up, appalled, delighted, the fortune hunter. She means to secure her place. And I felt the whole room begin to turn, in that terrible swift way a room turns, toward the woman at the foot of my table, and I understood in a cold flash of clarity that this was the stroke. This was Aldous' answer to my wall. Not a cup for me, a cup for a guest, poisoned to look like her poison so that my Duchess would hang or be cast off as a murderess, and my wall would be pulled down not by waiting but by the noose, and I would be left heirless and disgraced before the very assizes that were meant to save me. It was clean. It was patient. It was exactly my cousin, and it was working. I could see it working in every turning face. I half rose. I do not know what I meant to do, put myself between her and the room, I think, as I would have put myself between my men and a blade at the border. But I never had the chance, because Isabel Marrow was already on her feet, and she did not look like a woman drowning. She looked like a woman who kept the still room, and knew to the drop what was in every bottle in her house, and had just been accused of a poison she had not poured. She walked, she did not run. She walked, unhurried, into the center of all those turning faces to the sideboard where the cordial stood. She lifted the decanter, and in the ringing silence, with the whole hall staring and Verrill still gasping on the floor, she raised it and smelled it, deliberately, the way I had seen her smell 100 distillations in the still room, with the whole of her attention. And then she did the thing I have never forgotten, the thing I will carry to my grave. She poured herself a full glass of the cordial she stood accused of poisoning, and she drank it, all of it, before them all, and set the glass down. The silence changed. You could feel it change. "It is not the cordial," she said. Her voice was not loud, but the hall had gone so still that it reached every corner. "The cordial is mine. I made it. I have just drunk a full glass of it before all of you, and you may wait, if you like, to see whether I fall." She let a heartbeat pass and did not fall, and the room breathed. "I will not fall," she said, "because there is nothing in it but wine and spice and honey and the herbs of my own garden. What ails Mr. Verrill is not my cordial. Mr. Verrill has taken laudanum. I can smell it on him from here, and any physician in the room may confirm it. Laudanum, in a heavy dose, on top of a great deal of wine, and that is a thing that will make a man very ill and may make him worse. Fetch him mustard in warm water and fetch the physician, and he will live." She looked, for one moment only, one deliberate cool moment, at the corner where Netherby the under-steward stood white-faced by the sideboard. "But I will keep the vial from which someone was so kind as to physic him," she said, "for the emptied thing is here upon the floor where it fell from a pocket, and I will keep it, and the physician may examine what was truly in it, since we are all of us so very concerned tonight with what has been put in cups. I have commanded men, as I have told you. I have seen brave things done under fire at the border. I do not think I have ever in my life seen anything braver than my wife drinking, before a hall that wished to believe her a murderess, the cup they swore would kill her, because she knew her own work, and staked her life on knowing it, and turned the whole blade of my cousin's cleverness back upon the hand that held it. For the vial was real. It had fallen where a clumsy man drops a thing he has used in haste and meant to pocket, and the physician, sent for and come, confirmed both things before the sobering, staring hall, that Verrill was drugged with laudanum and something fouler besides, and that the Duchess's cordial, which he tested at her cool insistence, was clean. My cousin's stroke had landed on my cousin's own men. The whole hall had watched my Duchess drink the poison she was accused of pouring, and live, and name the true shape of the thing, and there was not a soul at that table who would ever again quite believe the whisper Aldous had spent so much to plant. I found her afterward in the still room. The house had at last gone quiet. Verrill had been carried off to be sick and to live. The guests had gone to their rooms with a great deal to think about. And in the still room, in the single candle, I found my wife standing at her bench with her back to me and her steady still-room hands, at long last, shaking now, when it was over, when no one could see, the way a soldier shakes after the fighting stops and not during it. I did not think. I crossed the room and I took those shaking hands in mine, both of them, and I held them the way she had held mine in the chapel, folding the tremor away inside the joining, steadying it against myself. And I said the only thing in me, which was not strategy, and had nothing to do with any bargain. "You might have died," I said, "to prove it, if you had been wrong about a single drop." "I'm not wrong about my own cordial," she said. Her voice was steady even while her hands were not. "Knowing what is in my bottles is the whole of my dowry, your grace. It is the one thing I have ever been able to stake my life on, because it is the one thing that has never lied to me." And then, quietly, not turning, her hand still in mine, "You held my hand at our wedding, so they would not see it shake. I have not forgotten it. I do not forget kindnesses. I have had few enough that I can afford to lose the memory of any of them. A breath. I knew you would try to stand between me and the room tonight. I saw you begin to rise. You would have put yourself in front of it, in front of the whisper, and that would have finished us both, the guilty wife and the doting fool of a duke shielding her. So I stood first. It was the only way to save us both. But I saw you begin to rise, Tristan. I saw it. And I will not forget that either." It was the first time she had used my name, not my title, my name. In the cold still room at our hour, with her hands shaking in mine and the war half turned in a single night, she called me Tristan, and I understood, standing there, that the ice had not merely shifted now but broken clean through, and that I had gone and fallen entirely and hopelessly in love with the woman I had married for spite, and that I had no notion under heaven whether she had married me for anything but a bargain, and no right, by the cold terms of that bargain, to ask. I held her hands until they were still, and then, because our treaty had bought me no right to hold them longer, I let them go and bid her good night, and went up alone through the sleeping house, and did not sleep, but lay awake till dawn, undone. A man who had set out to acquire an ally and had somehow acquired a whole heart he no longer had the least idea what to do with. Winter closed the roads, and my cousin, patient no longer, played his last card face up upon the table. For the poisoning had cost him. He had spent a careful whisper and one of his own men, and a good deal of his standing in the county on a stroke that had rebounded on his own hand, and he understood, as I understood, that the slow, patient road to Ravensmoor was finished. My wall had held. My Duchess had turned his cleverness back upon him before the whole assembled table. And a man like Aldous, when patience fails him, does not fall into rage, that was never his way, but into his final, coldest, most lawful weapon. He had waited to see whether I would die, and I had not died fast enough. He had tried to have my Duchess hanged, and she had drunk his poison and lived. So now, with the winter assizes upon us and no time left for waiting, he brought out the thing he had, I do not doubt, been holding in reserve all along against the moment the softer roads closed. A codicil, a last addition to my father's will, he claimed, made in secret in my father's final fevered days, a codicil that declared me unfit for the wardenship by reason of my wound and my want of an heir, and that named Aldous Crail keeper of Ravensmoor and the March in my stead. It was witnessed. It bore 2 signatures, 2 sworn men who would stand before the justices and swear they had watched my dying father set his hand to it. And it was, I knew in the marrow of my bones, a forgery. My father had done no such thing, would have done no such thing, had loved me and loathed Aldous to his last breath. But a forgery is not defeated by knowing it is one. A forgery is defeated by proof. And before a court, in the dead of a hard winter, with a wounded and heirless duke on one side, and a whole, hale, plausible cousin with 2 sworn witnesses on the other, a good forgery and 2 practiced liars can be more than enough to hand a great house from the man who holds it to the man who covets it. The assizes sat in the great hall of the shire town. 3 grim justices of the northern circuit come up on the winter round, hard men, unsentimental men, men who had heard every lie the border could invent, and were not to be moved by a duke's dignity or a cousin's smooth address, but only by what could be shown. I went before them with a case that was, in cold truth, thin. I had my certainty and my father's known mind and my own testimony, and against me stood a signed and witnessed instrument, and 2 men prepared to swear. Aldous' counsel laid the codicil before the bench, and Aldous' 2 witnesses told their smooth, rehearsed tale of the deathbed and the trembling hand and the signature, and I watched the 3 hard faces of the justices, and I could not read in them anything but the weighing of evidence, and the evidence on its face was his. It was Isabel who broke it, and she broke it with the still room. She had asked to come. It was not usual. A duchess does not commonly attend the assizes to hear her husband's cause, but she had said to me at our hour, the night before we rode down through the snow, "Bring the ledgers, Tristan, all of them, the still-room accounts back as far as they run, and let me come." And I had asked her why, and she, keeping now her own counsel, as I had learned to trust her to do, had said only, "Because a lie needs a stage to stand on, and I think I can pull the boards out from under this one. But I must see the thing itself. Bring me to where I can see the codicil, and bring the ledgers, and trust me one more time." And I had trusted her, as I now trusted her in all things, and so she stood beside me in the cold shire hall, in her gray gown and her great loose ring, unregarded by my cousin's counsel as she had been unregarded her whole life. The still-room keeper turned Duchess, whom no one on Aldous' side thought worth watching, which had always, always been their mistake. When my cousin's case was made and the codicil lay upon the bench, Isabel asked leave to approach it. There was a stir. A duchess is not a witness in the common way. But I was permitted to present her testimony, and the justices, perhaps curious, perhaps merely fair, allowed her to come near the instrument and to look at it. And she looked at it a long moment, not at the signatures, not at the words, but at the very paper and the wax of the seal. And then she turned to the bench and asked, in her clear, flat, still-room voice, a question that no one in that hall had thought to ask. "My lords," she said, "may I be told the date this codicil is said to have been made?" The date was given. My father's last fevered days, a date in the autumn, a 12-month and more gone by, some weeks before he died. "Then, my lords," said my wife, "I can tell you that it is a forgery, and I can tell you how I know. And I can show you, from records kept in my own hand, that no man could have written this instrument upon this day, because neither the paper it is written on nor the wax that seals it existed within the walls of Ravensmoor until a full year after that date. And I know it because I am the one who wrote down every quire and every stick of it as it came into the house, and my accounts do not lie. For I have never in my life had any reason to teach them how." And she laid her ledgers upon the bench before those three hard men. I want you to understand what those ledgers were and why they were unanswerable, for it is the whole heart of the reckoning. A great house so far from any town keeps its own stores of everything, its own paper, bought in quantity when the carrier could bring it up before the roads closed, its own sealing wax, its own candles, its own every small necessary thing, and every ounce of it as it came into the house, and as it was drawn out for use, was written down. And the writing down of it, in Ravensmoor, was Isabel's. It had been the still-room keeper's charge for longer than she had held the room, a dull, unregarded domestic accounting that no one in the house had ever once thought worth a glance, least of all my cousin, who counted stewards and ledgers of rent, and never in his life imagined that his ruin might be written in a still-room keeper's tally of sealing wax. For the codicil, she showed them, turning the pages of her own plain accounts, the dates in her own honest hand marching back through the seasons, was written upon a paper of a particular make, a heavier laid stock with a maker's mark she could name, that had not entered the stores of Ravensmoor until the spring just past, bought new that year, a full 12-month after my father was in his grave. And the wax of its seal was of a batch, a particular dark red she could identify by eye and by the accounts confirm, that had likewise come up with the same spring's carrier, and no sooner. She had the entries, she had the dates. She had, in 14 years of faithful, invisible tally-keeping, built without ever meaning to the one weapon in all of Ravensmoor that my cousin's cleverness could not touch, because he had never once imagined it was a weapon, because he had never once imagined the woman keeping it was anyone at all. A dying man in the autumn of one year cannot set his hand to a paper that will not be bought and carried up to his house until the spring of the next. The thing was impossible on its face, once the face was shown. And it was shown, in the flat, clear voice of a still-room keeper reading her own honest dates aloud, before three justices who had spent their lives learning to know the ring of truth from the ring of a lie, and who knew, as everyone in that cold hall now knew, that they had just heard the one and watched it shatter the other. My cousin's two sworn witnesses did then what bought men do when the ground opens beneath the thing they have sworn to. They looked at the ledgers, and they looked at the justices' faces, and they understood that they now stood one pace from a charge of perjury before the assizes, which is not a charge a man walks away from whole, and they saved themselves. First one then, seeing the first go, the other. They recanted. They named Aldous. They laid the whole forged instrument at his door and swore they had been paid and coached and promised, and begged the mercy of the court for men led astray by a great lord's money. And the whole patient edifice of the war my cousin had built inside my walls, the bought stewards, the poisoned dinner, the forged codicil, the long slow siege of a dying man, came down in that cold shire hall not in blood, not in a great reckoning of steel, but in paper and daylight and the sober voices of frightened men, undone by a domestic account book that no schemer had ever thought worth the reading. Aldous did not rage. I told you it was never his way. He sat very still while his witnesses unmade him, and his smooth face went, for the first time in all the months I had watched it, entirely blank, the face, I think, of a man recalculating and finding at last that there is nothing left to calculate. When it was done and the justices had spoken, and the codicil was declared the forgery it was and the wardenship confirmed in me past any further challenge, he rose and made me a small precise bow, cousin to cousin, and he looked once, one flat unreadable look, at my Duchess in her gray gown, the still-room keeper who had reckoned him to ruin with a book of sealing-wax, and then he left the hall. He left the North within the week. He did not come back in my lifetime, nor trouble Ravensmore again. There was a reckoning for him at law for the forgery and the rest, but that is another and a colder tale, and it is not the one I am telling. The war within my walls was over. It ended, as I say, not in blood but in the flat honest voice of a woman reading dates aloud, and I think there is a justice in that which pleases me still, in my old age, more than any justice of steel could ever have done. We rode home through the snow, and that night I went down to the still-room at our hour, as I had gone every night for a season, and I stood in the doorway among the drying herbs and the ranked bottles and the single candle, and I faced the thing I had been unable to face on the whole cold road home. The war was won. The wall had held, the poison had failed, the forgery was shattered, the wardenship was secure, and the line for a duke may live long yet who is no longer being slowly killed, and my wound, tended now by honest hands, had at last begun truly to close. The line would come in its own good time. The bargain had done everything I had asked of it, when I struck it in this same room, in this same candlelight, a lifetime and a season ago. Everything and far more. And by the cold terms of that bargain, we might now go on exactly as we were. Allies, a duke and his duchess under one roof, at an honest and appointed distance, having each brought to the treaty what the other needed and having each been fully and honorably paid. I had promised her that. I had offered her in this room rank and safety and a name no ledger could erase, in exchange for an heir and an alliance, and I had said plainly that I asked for no affection, having none to offer. She had held me to no more than the bargain. She had asked me for nothing beyond its terms in all the seasons since, and I stood in the doorway and understood that I could not bear it, that I would rather lose the whole hard-won war over again than go on for the rest of my life at the honest appointed distance from the woman I had married for spite and come, God help me, to love past all bearing. The danger is past, I said. She was at her bench, she turned. You have kept your side of our bargain, Isabel, past all imagining and past all thanks. You saved my life at that table, and you saved the whole of everything in that shire hall today with a book of sealing-wax which I think no man in the history of the North has ever done before you. You owe me nothing further, not one thing. The bargain is discharged and more than discharged, and if you wished it, you could keep from this night forward entirely to your own life. The still-room, your own hours, your own heart, and I would honor every word of what we agreed to my last day, and never once ask you for more than the letter of it. I know, she said. She did not look away from me. You would. That is why I have never feared you, Tristan, from the first night in this room. A man who keeps a cold bargain honestly is a man who can be trusted with a warm one. She set down the thing in her hands. But you did not come down here at 3 in the morning to tell me the bargain is discharged. You have not slept but in this room at this hour in a season, so say the thing you came to say. And so I said it. I made myself say it plainly, plainer than I had ever said anything, because I had promised her once in this room that I would never lie to her, and this was the truest thing that was in me, and I owed it to her whole and unhidden whatever it cost. I have never once in my life been chosen, I said. Do you understand what I am telling you? I have been feared, I have been obeyed. I have been plotted against and bargained for and buried before I was dead, and married for a wardenship by girls I sent home. I have been my whole life a title and a wound and a seat on the border that men wanted and never once, not once, a man that anyone chose. Even you, Isabel, I bought you. I came to you in this room and I offered you a cold bargain, rank for an heir, and you took it, and you owed me nothing but the letter of it, and you have given me 100 times more than the letter, and it is still at the bottom of everything a bargain, and I find I cannot live inside it. I am asking you now for the one thing that was never in it and that you owe me nothing of. My voice was not steady. I let it not be steady. I had promised her the truth, and the truth was not steady. Stay. Not as my Duchess. Not to keep the house from my cousin is gone, and there is no more war, and you are free. Stay because I cannot any longer sleep except in this cold room at this dead hour with the one soul on this earth I have never had to guard myself against, and I do not want to learn to sleep any other way, and I will not if you go so much as try. I did not marry you for love, Isabel. I know that. I have no right to it. I am asking you past every right to stay for it. She was quiet a long moment, and then she came around the bench, across the small cold room, and she stood close before me, and she took my hand in her two still hands, the hand that shook, that had shaken at our wedding and shaken through a season of the wound and the war, and she held it, the way she had held it in the chapel, folding the tremor of it away inside the warmth of her own two hands. But there was no watching man to hide it from now. There was no Netherby, no assembled hall, no cousin, no stage, no bargain. There was only the two of us in the candlelight, and she held my shaking hand and did not hide it, but held it plainly because she wished to. I drank the poison at that table, she said, because I knew the cordial was clean. I make it. I know to the drop what is in my own bottles. I do not wager my life on things I do not know. I am not a woman who leaps in the dark, Tristan. I never have been. The world taught me too early and too hard what it costs. She lifted my hand and pressed it, warm, against her cheek and held it there. So hear me, and know that I do not say it lightly, for I have never in my life said a thing I did not know to be true. I have watched you for a season, at 3 in the morning in this cold room, a wounded man who could have handled me with a smooth lie and instead gave me the true count of his own dying because I asked it. A besieged man who began to rise from his own high table to put himself between me and a whisper that would have hanged me, though it would have finished him. A man who kept every letter of a cold bargain so honestly that I stopped, months ago, being afraid of anything he might ever do. She drew a breath. You say you have never been chosen. Then let me be the first and the last and be done with your counting. I am not staying for the bargain. The bargain is finished, as you say, and I am glad of it, for I do not want to spend my life inside a treaty. I am staying, Tristan, for the man who held my hand in a cold chapel so that a stranger would not see it shake, and who then, in all the long season after, having every power in the north to command me, never once asked me for a single thing I had not freely chosen to give. That is the man I am choosing, not the Duke, not the wardenship, that man. And I choose him with my eyes open, which is the only way I have ever chosen anything, and the only way worth the having. I am an old man now, and I have told you the truth of it, as I promised her long ago in a cold room that I would always, to anyone who had the right, tell the truth of my own life. I married for spite and strategy, and a wall against a cousin who was buying my house out from under me one soul at a time. I married the one woman in all of Ravensmoor whom no one had thought worth the buying, because no one had ever thought her worth the seeing, and she saw my wound, and named my danger, and shielded my weakness with her own hand, and drank my enemy's poison to save us both, and reckoned a forger to ruin with a book of sealing wax, and did all of it, every part of it, while owing me nothing but the cold letter of a bargain. And when the war was won and the bargain discharged and she stood entirely free to go, she stayed. Not for the rank, not for the safety, not for the name that no ledger could erase. She stayed for the man bought her, cold, dying, half-ruined, and undeserving as he was, and she chose him with her eyes open, in a still room at 3 in the morning freely, when there was nothing left on earth to make her. It is the only thing I was ever given that no cousin could scheme away, and no court could overturn, and no ledger could erase. A poor woman who owned nothing in this world but her own unbuyable honesty looked at the most feared and most alone man in the North, and chose him for himself. And I spent every year that was granted me after, and there were, in the end, a great many more of them than the physicians ever swore to, trying and failing and gladly failing to deserve it. We keep the still room yet. She would not give it up. It was in the bargain, and it is hers, and I would not take from her the one honest thing that was hers before she was ever mine. And on the coldest nights, when the wound that long ago healed still remembers the border in the deep of the year, I go down to it, out of an old habit that has become the dearest thing I own, down through the sleeping house to the low stone room that smells of rosemary and beeswax, at 3 in the morning, our hour, and she is there, and I set the whole weight of a long life down before her, as I set it down the first night, and she takes it as she took it then, and folds it into her clear grave understanding, and holds my old hand in her two steady ones, and does not hide the holding. For she chose me, in the dark, with her eyes open, when there was nothing to make her. And a man who has been chosen so, even once, even late, even undeserving, a man who has been chosen so is no longer, in any way that matters, alone.